that this presence, this existence is magically generative. It's creative. And that's why there's this constant change. And again, like the fact that stuff exists at all, that's another inexplicable miracle. Why does this stuff, which happens to exist, why is it constantly generative? Why is it always changing instead of static? So I like to think of that as the female nature of the cosmos, because it's generative like the female is. And that accounts for the fact that things appear and disappear. That is, they're born, they live, and they die, and they vanish into, they seem to be born out of nothing, live, and then die back into nothing and vanish. And that brings me back to the Milky Way, which everything that lives and dies, the mountains live in, a mountain range is born and eventually vanishes. The planet will eventually vanish. The sun will eventually even was born and will vanish. In fact, the sun is a third generation sun, I think. There have been 3 generations before our sun. But I kind of think that galaxies are so huge that maybe they're sort of permanent, but it turns out they're not. This is another picture of the Milky Way with the 2 galaxies in red and blue swirling around it, scattering their stars. And this is another image of it. It looks more like a telescope image. And they say that, some people say that we are, our solar system, and therefore us, we are not actually part of the Milky Way, but we're from one of these foreign galaxies that's spinning through the Milky Way. And I kind of like that in an age where there's sort of nationalism and multiculturalism clashing, the idea that not only is it not any kind of purist race or nation, but we're not even part of the Milky Way or non-Milky Way beings. I also just saw, because there's been a lot of research, or a lot of imagery from Mars lately, and talk like they just discovered liquid water on Mars, which is pretty amazing, that there are scientists who think that we are not, that life did not begin on Earth, but in fact it began on Mars and came to Earth on some kind of, like a comet hit Mars and blew off dust and debris, ended up hitting the Earth. And there are reasons for that, like the early environment of Mars was more hospitable to the origin of life than Earth. So we're not Earthlings either, we're Martians, really. So change is the fundamental nature of things. And to Chinese, this is a Neolithic bowl, which sort of shows that sense of dynamic energy and absence and presence, the energy emerging out of absence. And here's another one. So this is a very, very old worldview, and it comes up in the Tao Te Ching, which is the original Taoist text, which is usually dated like 500 or 600 BC, but is oral material that could go way, way back into really early cultures where this idea of a female cosmos would have been more natural than it is to us. And that whole idea of change, the Chinese had this image of a dragon was an image of change and that sort of dynamic energy of the cosmos. So dragons are, in the fall, dragons go down into deep water and hibernate, and then when they are reborn, they come out of the water, and that's the beginning of life again, of spring. And they ascend into the sky and fall as spring rains, and lightning is their claws in the clouds, and there's the stories like that go on and on. They're also as big as the 10,000 things, or as big as the cosmos, and as small as a silkworm. So they're sort of all destruction, all creation. Here's another dragon. And one more dragon. And this one is interesting because it's the idea of the dragon and this idea of the cosmos as constant change is an idea of the cosmos as this constant kind of generative energy. And this painter, while painting the dragon as a kind of mythic image for that energy, also, if you look at the left-hand side, at some point started just flinging the ink onto the silk, enacting that energy of the cosmos instead of just painting it from outside. And that's something that Chinese painters actually do a lot in sophisticated ways, but here it's pretty dramatic. And it reminds us of this, which you all recognize as Pollock, who was doing exactly the same thing when he made his paintings. He was trying to enact the energy of what he called nature. He said, someone said something to him about, why don't you paint nature? He said, I don't want to paint nature, I am nature. By which he meant he moves with the energy of the cosmos. He's not outside of that and painting it. So here's this picture again. So in China, to be a sage means to dwell as part of this whole cosmological process. And one way is meditation. Another way is artistic practices. So I'm going to describe meditation, and I'm going to show you how it works in painting, calligraphy, and poetry. So for meditation for them was a little like that experiment I did at the beginning where you strip everything out of your mind, but you sort of do it in consciousness this time. So first thing you do is just watch what's going on in your mind, and you notice thoughts are coming and going and coming and going. And you realize, one of the first realizations that you are separate from your thoughts. And we usually think of ourselves as, of identity as that thinking thing. And when you meditate, you immediately realize, well, I'm not that, I'm something separate. I can watch it from outside. If you sit for a while and your thoughts slow down and you can sort of start seeing how they behave, and you see that you can sort of watch them emerge out of nothing, evolve, maybe turn into other thoughts, obsess, but eventually vanish and a new thought starts. And with that, you start to, the Chinese saw that our minds, that consciousness works just the way all the rest of the universe works. That is, we all would think of the mind as fundamentally separate from the material universe. But they saw that it operates exactly the same way. 10,000 things come out of this emptiness and go back into it. Thoughts come out of that same emptiness. And if you sit long enough, your thoughts might fall completely silent, and then you're just sitting with that silence, with that generative source. And that's, for the Chinese, is the deepest way to dwell as part of this cosmos and this cosmological process. And that's the point where it's sort of from that point that the arts grow. Because from that point, if you look out, perception becomes a kind of spiritual act. And because it's empty mind, if you think about that, when you open your eyes and you're looking out, the mind is like a mirror. It's just mirroring what's in front of you. And that mirroring sort of replaces your identity. So in that moment of perception, they see the limitations of personal identity. They see there's no separation between them and the world. And at the deepest level, you realize that when you're looking out with that kind of emptiness, you're really the cosmos looking out at itself. That's a pretty remarkable place to be. So that empty mind is the framework or the origin of Chinese arts and how their arts function. And I want to start with paintings like this. And the funny thing about this painting compared to a Western painting is all the empty space that isn't filled in. Now, empty space is because this isn't trying to realistically paint a landscape, it's trying to paint that cosmology I described to you. So the empty space is that absence, that generative absence from which things are born, The mountains are sort of emerging out of that and look like they're about to vanish back into it. And here the pictorial excuse for emptiness is mist. All that mist that's coming up across those mountain ranges. And if you look on the left, you can see the mist is starting to come right up to where that guy is standing. It's starting to shroud the trees. So it feels like this whole landscape is in the process of vanishing back into mist. When people looked at this, a painting like this, it would be a kind of spiritual practice. They might look at it with that empty mind, sort of mirroring it. They might look at it for hours on end. And when you look at that with that empty mind, that mirror mind, the emptiness and presence in the paintings becomes that in your mind. So it's a way, painting is a way to put that whole cosmology I described, to experience it directly and immediately. And that's difficult to do in normal everyday life. So it makes the painting a kind of microcosm of the macrocosm of the universe. So there were two strategies to render this cosmology, this idea of this ontological immediacy where you're looking with an empty mind. One of them is minimalism, which you can see a little bit here. Oh, here's just another painting showing another way that it looks like landscape is coming out of emptiness. And you'll notice on the bottom left there's a couple of lines going down. It's a waterfall. So there's a river there, and the bottom of the painting is a lake. So those are the elements in paintings that they used for emptiness. Sky, mist, lakes, and rivers. And here's a painting that would be really on that minimalist side of things. There's almost nothing. This is almost all emptiness. So then it really emphasizes the emptiness and also emphasizes the vastness of things, because there are just a very few things that really catch your attention. And the main emptiness there is a huge lake, and you can see that because can you see the fisherman on a little slip of the boat right here? So that sort of tells you that there's water there. But unlike a Western painting that would have painted all that space with blues and grays and greens to make it look like water, the whole point here is emptiness. And here's the other strategy, which is a kind of maximalist strategy of trying to just portray the overwhelming wonder of this cosmos, or the cosmology. This one is a really famous painting, and to me it feels like the presence of those cliffs is just sort of burgeoning out of you. And here's a detail, and let's see if you can see another detail. And one interesting thing here, which is very typical of Chinese paintings, is that if human beings are in the painting at all, they're very, very small. They're meant to be an integral part of the landscape as opposed to the center of attention. So here you can see a few travelers in the bottom there with some mules. And you can also see, if you look in the top right, you can see, but you almost don't notice it because it almost looks like it's part of the landscape. There's a monastery. You see some roofs up there. So the painting tradition is largely moving between these two extremes, and I'll just show you some examples. There's a huge scroll, it's like 30 feet long, this is just a little piece of it. Both empty, but the rocks have that sense of kind of resonant presence. And here's another one, which operates in an interesting, different way, because you can see, we use ink in painting to create an illusion. And here the illusion is a cliff with a guy standing there looking up at some blossoms hanging down into empty space. But if you look at this very closely, you can see that these brushstrokes really call attention to themselves as brushstrokes. And then the illusion starts to crumble, and you start seeing just a kind of abstract forms, or it returns you to that absence. because the illusion just sort of dissolves. Here's another great one, mountain range, but you can see, here's the detail, you can see how alive those mountains are. They're alive with this kind of life energy. And this painting is described as a dragon mountain that's sort of lifting off in some vast wind and about to fly away. So, moving to calligraphy, which is the most mysterious of Chinese arts because there's nothing like it in the West. It's not at all a matter of fancy handwriting. It's closer to abstract expressionist painting. And it does a number of things. One is when we read a text, we only pay attention to the black stuff. We don't ever pay attention to the empty space around it. But calligraphy animates that empty space. And that empty space is language works just like everything else in Chinese. That the words are emerging out of that emptiness, just like the 10,000 things. They're just like thoughts in your head. So this kind of animates that emptiness and makes the characters very, very dynamic. This is what that looks like, just would look like in a book, that same text. And you see how rectilinear, or sort of each character is very orderly and fills a small box. And then just compare to that. So one of the things that calligraphy does is animates that empty space. One of it is that it's sort of dissolving language. The characters are kind of coming apart. And that comes back to that idea that language is something that separates us from reality. So he's dissolving, this calligrapher is sort of dissolving that separation by dissolving the language into empty space. And the last thing that calligraphers are trying to do is act like Jackson Pollock, act with the energy of the cosmos. And that's part of what you can see it here when you compare it to that. You can see how dynamic and energetic all that writing is. And here's a calligrapher who's really famous for that. This is calligraphy where it's just pure abstraction. You can't read much of this at all. And here's the detail of it. So this is very, very wild writing. And this is from in the 800s, I think. So it's pretty old. So moving on to poetry. Here's a line in poetry. And it's, if you look at that for a minute, you will see that it looks a lot different from the English line sentence. And the things that are different about it, one is there's an awful lot of empty space around the characters in the sense of, in the grammatical sense. It doesn't tell, all the information you need to read this isn't written down in that sentence the way it is in English. And one of the most dramatic things that's missing there is the subject, right? And so we have to, as you read Chinese, you're always filling in all that empty space. It's sort of the reader's job. It's a very creative job in Chinese. But again, all that empty space, I think, is because it partakes in that same cosmology where the words are emerging out of a kind of emptiness. The emptiness that's around a poem. That's why Chinese poems tend to be very small, like the ones I read you. And also the emptiness that's sort of right there in the grammar. Another interesting thing about this is that that I that's there, that we fell in, on the one hand it's there, but on the other hand it's not. So it's a kind of absent presence. And remember we were talking about, like, when you open your eyes in the field, that's this very more real, most fundamental sense of who you are, and that is that you're kind of absent awareness or an empty awareness. So that's what this language enacts. There's no I written in the language which separates a kind of identity out. And then the last thing about Chinese that's so interesting and different is there's a lot of pictographic stuff in it. That is, it's not an alphabetic language. It's a word is one of these characters. And most elements and characters at least began as pictures, and which is supposedly true of all languages, but most languages switch to alphabetic, so they're phonetic and represented speech. But Chinese held on to all the pictographic stuff. And this is, and that's also important in terms of that cosmology, because the pictographs keep the language closer to things in and of themselves, as opposed to alphabetic language where a word has no direct relationship to the thing in reality that it's represented. So these are the oracle bones, the earliest surviving, the oldest surviving forms of Chinese writing, even though, these are like 1200 BCE, even though the language is fully developed, so it's much, much older than this. And there you can see some pictures like animals. In the middle, that middle column, you can see two animals with heads. See? That one and that one. That's a tree with branches and roots and a trunk. And that one's a cart with the sort of the place where you might stand or put stuff in the two wheels. I think this one's a child with the head and the body and arms. So that, just to summarize, that cosmology structures everything in ancient China. The cosmos, with things coming out of emptiness and dying back into it. Consciousness, with thoughts coming out of emptiness. Language, with words coming out of emptiness and going back into it. Painting and calligraphy, like I showed you. And also the structure of perception, that sense of absent consciousness, or an empty consciousness, aware of things. So what I want to do to end is to read a few poems, not poems. This is a book that just came out a week ago. The I Ching, which is the very, very earliest of all Chinese texts. And I'm going to read, I want to read a little bit of it so you can hear it describing this cosmology that I described to you. Usually we look to the Tao Te Ching, which is maybe 500 years later than this, and it's much more developed. But here you can still hear it in the I Ching in a much more primal form. So I Ching, I don't know if you know, but it has 64 chapters. Each one has a hexagram, and then it has sort of commentaries about the hexagram. It's really great because the actual text of the I Ching is this hexagram. So the actual text of the I Ching is sort of proto-language. It's not even language yet. It's so primal. And then the rest of this is technically commentaries on the hexagram by later writers. So the first hexagram, oh yeah, I was going to tell you the story of where the hexagrams came from. They're at the very beginning of things, when heaven and earth emerged from just primal chaos or something. The first two, there was two humans emerged. And they became the original emperor and empress, but they were only half human and they were half dragon. Remember the dragon, the image had changed? And they were the first couple. So the empress gave birth to humankind, so that's the source of people. And the emperor, among a number of other things, invented the hexagrams. So the hexagrams were invented by a half dragon, half human at the very beginning of the cosmos. At least that's the legend I like to tell, or that the Chinese like to tell. So here I'll just read a few of the commentaries. So this is heaven. The first two chapters are heaven and earth. So I'll read a little bit from each one. Heaven. All origins penetrating everywhere, heaven is inexhaustible in bringing forth wild bounty. And then a second commentary says, how vast and wondrous the heaven of origins. The 10,000 things all begin from it. It governs the sky, the movement of clouds, the coming of rain. It gives all the various things their distinct forms. How vast its illumination of ends and beginnings. The way of heaven is all change and transformation at the hinge of things, where the unfurling nature of each thing itself is perfected. It nurtures vast harmony and wholeness, and it remains inexhaustible in bringing forth wild bounty. When its dragon head rears up among the innumerable things, it unites the 10,000 kingdoms in wholeness and peace. So the next one is earth. Maybe I can say that heaven, these lines are either yin or yang, male or female. Heaven is all male, and earth is all female, all broken lines. And it's yin and yang is another two fundamental elements of the universe, and it's their interaction, male and female, that keeps that process of change going. So the first two sort of set the stage for the whole book because they're the two fundamental, male and female. So this is earth. All origins penetrating everywhere. Earth is inexhaustible as a mare horse and bringing forth wild bounty. And then the second commentary says, how perfect and wondrous the earth of origins. The 10,000 things are all born from it. Yielding and devoted as a river, it supports the sky. It carries things along in its generosity, joins them boundlessly in its heart-sight clarity, opens them away all vast radiance in its embrace, and it unites all the various things in wholeness, penetrating everywhere. All right, so that's what I have. And questions and answers are okay? Yeah, okay. So I can answer questions if anyone has them. Questions?
How do you deal, or how do you approach heaven, singular, capital H, versus the heavens, plural, lowercase h, when dealing with Tian in Chinese, one character? What affects your decision to render it as, at least here, as heaven singular? And do you capitalize that?
Yeah, I don't. Have you read all of my books? You might know more than I do. I don't think I capitalize heaven ever, but
I
okay. But I know why you're asking that. No, yeah, the word heaven could just mean sky. But philosophically, originally there was a monotheistic God in China. That started fading away. That was replaced by heaven. They want so instead of a personal God, it became this kind of divine principle. And then, this is all for political reasons that are kind of complicated, but then that got replaced philosophically by the idea of heaven as natural process. That natural process I was describing. And then that was a way of making, it was kind of like pantheism in the West, like among the Romantics and 19th century people, as a way of making, once the idea of a monotheistic God became untenable, people still felt the wonder of everything and wanted to make it divine, so they started calling it heaven in China, or here people started calling it God. God is everything. So that redefining heaven as natural process was a way of making things divine, and then eventually that was replaced by Tao, the namesake of Taoism. And so, to answer your question, I think in just about everything I translate, it's at that last stage, as just natural process. And the I Ching is in that transition realm, and sometimes it might be something closer to a divinity or a divine principle. However, the funny thing about the I Ching is that it's constantly like it's the book of change, and it itself is in constant transformation, because it's so early in the language that we don't really know what a lot of the words meant originally. So it's the meaning and the meaning of, in fact, the definitions of words in it have evolved over the centuries according to how people, according to the way people saw the world, according to the evolution of philosophy. So, in a sense, you can read back into the I Ching and read it as that final natural process happened. Because I think that's how the intellectuals through China probably were reading it. Because they were constantly reading it, not trying to get back to the scholarly, pure, original I Ching, but they were reading it through their own perspective. That's a kind of a long answer, but did it answer you? Okay.
It's a little specific, but who was the person who said, I don't want to paint nature, I am nature?
Yeah.
Who was that?
Jackson Pollock, who painted that painting I showed you.
Okay. Thank you.
I think Picasso might have said that too. But for Pollock, it really was essential.
You said that the creative job of a reader of calligraphy is to fill in the space. Equivalent's not the right word, really, but what would be kind of equivalent for Western language?
Yeah, I don't think there is did you all hear that? You said, I said that there's so much empty space in Chinese that you have to fill it in, and that makes the reader very creative. And what's the equivalent in the West? I don't think there's an equivalent because it isn't a matter of like, what for us we would think about ambiguity, and you have to sort of parse out ambiguity or something. Well, that's in Chinese too, but we don't have that sense in the fundamental grammar of all of this empty space that you have to fill in. For instance, they often don't have a subject. One, the verbs have no tenses, so it doesn't tell you anything about when something happened. Singular, plural, you don't know. It won't tell you. Often verbs are gone. Often objects are gone. And sometimes in poems, the commentaries of a poem are important because they're trying to figure out how to fill in those spaces. And also conjunctions, like how do pieces of the poem fit together? Is it like this piece and this, or is it this but this, or is it or any other possibility? So I think there's this real fundamental difference, and I think it's because of that whole cosmology I described, and that's why language is the way it is.
But then, if commentary, I was fascinated by your remark that commentary on text then becomes very important.
Mm-hmm.
But as soon as there's commentary, that's a step away from the thing in itself.
Yeah, right. And you often...
Funny to think about.
Yeah. And the commentaries, it's like people could disagree. Often it's like commentary might say, well, who's saying this? And who are they talking to? Is it a poet saying this? Is it somebody else? Are they talking to a friend? Are they talking to themselves? Are they talking to a lover? You know, and you can't definitively answer those questions. You can often, there's like most of the poems I read, there's a convention that a poem like those is about the poet's immediate experience. So you can sort of, you can fill in an I, like in that line that I showed you. But again, it interestingly remains a kind of absent presence. You, yeah.
So then when you're translating some of these poems, what's your process for how much do you have to fill in for
Yeah.
audience?
I usually have to fill that stuff in because I have to make English that reads nicely. I try to make an English that's really pared down and minimal but eloquent or elegant and at the same time to get a little bit of the feel. Because if I translated English, I could make an English poem that's as empty as the Chinese, but it would sound like a very experimental, strange poem. And that wouldn't be true. And I've often been tempted to do that, or just do a book of 30 poems and play that game with them. Maybe I'll do that at some point. But because I'm translating a whole tradition, and I want it to have a voice, the voice of that tradition. And that would not be a true, the Chinese tradition, they go the opposite directions. The more minimal the Chinese gets, the more elegant it gets, the more, what's the word? The more elegant and eloquent it gets. For English, it's sort of the other way around. That this hacking up this very, very simple, hacked up language is not elegant and eloquent. It's more really elegantly formed long sentences. So in general, I mean, there are lots of ways of making English that's very simple, like Hemingway or something that's also elegant. But in general, the nature of the language is sort of reversed. So I'm trying to play some little game, trying to make it really chiseled and clean, but eloquent at the same time. Mm-hmm.
You just mentioned like I Ching, the traditional Chinese classic, and I think from most Chinese things like I Ching is mainly about like observing what the nature and like to arrange people's business or activity.
Mm-hmm.
So because it's like the eight, I think you just mentioned hexagram, it's about Qian Kun, and that's like heaven, earth, then thunder, and also like the mountain, and water, fire, and also wind and spark. The eight like you've mentioned that's like the nature, what they like observe nature and then arrange things.
Mm-hmm.
In the description of these 64 I think the word is
Hexagram.
oh yeah, the 68 hexagram is based on this 8 element.
Yeah, I think it's fundamentally based on yin and yang, 2 elements. Because the solid line is yang and the broken line is yin.
And then they make that into, combine the yin and yang together into the several different elements.
Yeah.
I think it's more than because in Tao Te Ching that mention Tao gave birth to 1, 2, and 1 gave birth to 2, and 2 gave birth to 3,
Mm-hmm.
and then I mentioned 3 is 1 is yin and 1 is yang, and the 3 is he, that the harmony fits.
Isn't one,
Yeah.
I don't think 1 is yin. Isn't
No, 1
2
is
yin and
yang.
yang? 1 is like sort of primal chaos,
Yeah.
and 2 is yin and yang, and then 3 is all the 10,000 things coming out of yin and yang. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So in my view, I think is more connected to Tao Te Ching than
More connected to what?
Tao Te Ching.
Emptinesses?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, probably everything is, because that whole system is very primal, kind of half formed in the I Ching, but it's there. I think everything is there in the I Ching. It's just not as worked out and explained as it is in the Tao Te Ching. Other questions? Mm-hmm.
I might have a couple of questions.
That sounds scary, so I'll drink some water and get ready.
I'm interested in well, maybe I'll just ask what kind of relationship do you have with translation from Chinese?
Pound?
Yeah, I'm thinking about, so for instance, Pound would say that it's only bad.
Yeah, we always did.
Oh,
Didn't he?
but I think, yeah, the opposite. It's
Pound-
not necessarily a specific subject.
Yeah, Pound's, I think, Pound's translations, we were talking the other day of some, about the river merchant's wife. Pound's translations were driven to a large extent by his interest in Chinese language as concrete and trying to make an English language as concrete. So that kind of overrode everything else. And for instance, in The River Merchant's Wife, somebody was asking me the other day, I was at another school, and how mine is different from that one, because I've also translated it. And I thought mine, I'm trying to get an actual living voice. So mine, I think, sounds more like a young girl talking, kind of vulnerable, tentative. His sounds, like Ezra Pound. So I'm trying to reinvent a kind of a living voice, and I think Pound had this more theoretical interest, which was, fantastic because it changed poetry. And that's what it was a great thing to do. Next question? More? Come on, that's all right.
We'll talk later.
Okay.
People, I just know that people are starting to mute. I don't think they want to hear me ask a question.
Any others?
When you were discussing calligraphy, you said, as far as something in the West, I would liken it to abstract expression. You also referenced Pollock more than once in your discussion, and I think actually abstract expressionism more than once. Would you expand on that just a bit?
Oh.
How they're alike?
Yeah, because they're one is lots of abstract expressionism is gestural. It's about energy, not all of it, but a lot of it. Like Pollock and de Kooning and Klein and others. And the other thing is abstract expressionism is, maybe expressing or enacting some kind of spiritual or emotional states without using images, but as doing it in a purely abstract form. And that's what calligraphy was doing.
Would you agree that abstract expressionism excuse representation?
Excuse representation?
Excuse. Dismisses representation.
I think that's what it does, doesn't it? I mean, it's not representative.
It doesn't represent something.
Right. But it does.
Does calligraphy?
But it represents, if you mean, it represents or enacts some spiritual states or emotional states. Is that okay? You don't think it does that?
No, I'm thinking of the history of abstract expressionism. It was working against representation.
Right. And so this is the same kind of thing. It's not just fancy handwriting. It is. Calligraphy was considered as perfectly abstract, and it was considered the clearest window, more profound, more clear than painting, into the calligrapher's deep character and whatever wisdom, insight. So this person, for instance, if you look at this, you might describe this as someone who's, one, profoundly wise, but also pretty crotchety and independent, because those characters are just really weird and squalid. He was enlightened to calligraphy when he looked out and he was watching people rowing. And as they rowed, he watched that long, solid stroke of the rowing. And that's kind of, I'm thinking that's a kind of a spiritual thing. It's to have this just really solid, straight through perspective on things. But at the same time, he has this quirky sense of humor, but you can see that long, solid thing in these lines. Mm-hmm. And this one, let me show you what where is it? That thing there becomes this. See how it's just these long, wandering, liberated almost gestures. And that just simple little straight line becomes that. Long wandering line which is thick and thin. There's no attempt to make a nice clean line. It wanders, it gets a little thicker, a little thinner, it drops sort of quirky little bend off, and then just trails off. It's like he has no cares in the world, nothing worrying him. And at the same time, he's very quirky. He has a sense of humor because a lot of that is just kind of bizarre playing, a lot of these forms. Does that make sense? Is that an
Do you
answer?
see pictographs as representing anything?
Pictographs? Yeah, often. Because they're actual pictures of an animal. Or does that make sense?
Yeah, well, it does.
Any others? Okay.
Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you all so much for coming this evening to our second Trias event back-to-back on this beautifully warm evening for this time of year. You are in luck because we have another wonderful, excellent reader. First, I want to, as some of you have already heard the stuff, but I want to thank Peter Trias, who is the patron saint, the person who started the Trias reading series for us and the Trias Writer in Residence program, who has made it so that all of you have access to what I think is one of the most amazing undergraduate programs, creative writing programs in the country because of this class that you get to take. You know, you get to I guess compete to take with the Trias Writer fall semester. That's a nationally acclaimed writer every fall semester, someone different every year, and you get to have these wonderful, wonderful readers come through town and interact with them. So congratulations for being the recipients of this wonderful gift from a Hobart alum. I want to thank the Provost's office. I want to thank the English department, Asian Studies, and I forgot to say last time, Art and Architecture all helped co-sponsor this event in addition to Trias. And I think that is everything. The reading's coming up. Michael Burkhardt will be reading on November 19th. It's the next reader in this series. He's a wonderful poet who happens to be here tonight, and also an amazing musician. I have recently discovered a songwriter and a Hobart alum, so he'll have wonderful things to say about the Blackwell Room when it was the library, and it was wonderful to talk to about this campus. So be sure to come to that. Next semester we've got Jess Rowe coming out for a week. He's going to be our week-long writer in residence, a wonderful fiction writer, and Jen Bervin, the poet, visual artist, etc., coming out in March. So keep an eye out for those readings. And Mary Ruffel, our writer in residence right now, will be introducing the readers.
I once sat astonished while Jody Gladding held in her hands before an audience a large melting icicle fallen from an eave in January and translated its dripping as it dripped, spontaneously as any UN translator during a summit meeting. Whimsy? Yes. But how willing she was to let her hand freeze as she bore her responsibility as interpreter. Jody Gladding's vision is predicated by the knowledge that language was born of the earth, came from the earth itself, that great mouth cave, and where we wound the earth, we wound language. When a species is lost, a language perishes with it. The multidiversity of life is the multidiversity of language itself. And our responsibility as artist-interpreters is a diverse one, for all artists are interpreters no less than their audiences. A multiplicity of itself at every breath and turn is our responsibility. Her work as a poem maker, a nest builder, a translator of what the Beatles have written in wood, a bory liner, as in lining the inside of an ancient stone wayfarer's hut in France, working patiently as a spider for months, sheep's wool and red thread, then inviting the villagers to come take it away. All these tasks are the tasks of a weaver, woman's work, stitching it all together so the womb of the world will hold and bring forth new life in the future. All these tasks are part of her remarkable artistry. I don't know why she loves red thread, and I'd never ask her. But my own answer is this. She loves red thread because there is a bloodline connecting all things, animals, plants, and minerals, and everywhere it is easily broken and must be constantly mended. A thankless task for this or any other millennium, yet one she has dedicated herself to, like Whitman's patient spider, with the great rhythmic weaving of her luminous mind.
Thank you, Mary. It's really, really nice to be here. Thank you all. I'm going to start with a poem, an old poem that comes from my time in Ithaca, New York, just down the road. Because somehow this is reconnecting me to that time. And it's called Taganek Falls. Some of you might know this place. Taganek Falls. I want to show you a landscape of layers. Imagine a page of Braille. Imagine the Chinese character for dream, grass over eye, over cover, over evening. You are above the falls looking down to a stone bridge where figures in plump jackets cluster like berries, and it's colder there, already dark. Scan the gray strata for pigeons splintering off, slate without slate's gravity. Rise with them to that fringe of trees, then swoop and settle on a winking ledge where cedars, slow reptiles, wrench themselves from rock, straining back for ground and out for sun, so that no branch isn't also root. Look higher, where a leaf, flaking off from the light, substantial enough to be called yellow, spirals down, out of the breathing surface, past the moment's pigeon and cedar, past whole centuries conflated to slab, drifts down, and you, watching, imagine now it must land, and still it spirals and drifts, and you exhale, and still it's hovering, still airborne, until now, finally, it's floating there on the water that collects under the falls, the water deep, blue, and patient, waiting for the leaf it's just now beginning to fathom to dissolve into wet stars. There was a full moon 2 nights ago, which according to some traditions would be called the travel moon. Travel Moon. Can everyone hear me?
Why is it called travel?
I don't know. This poem comes from a series of poems they did, and I had found all the Native American names for moons, and just kind of really loved them. And then I would choose the name I loved most and go through the month trying to figure out why the month was named after that moon. And if I didn't figure it out, I had to wait another year before I could write the poem. So the project took several years to finish. So all I can say, Mary, is that the answer may be the poem. Travel Moon. So what is turning away? I'm off again to witness the fall that each leaf does. This I know. Yet I could stand here among the beautiful wasted days forever and not see a single one let go. I'm just reading one poem from each book, and then I'm going to move on to new things. This is Sonogram of Raven Calls. So you may be tired of Chinese by now, but if you're not, the other thing I do besides Raven calls is I translate French. And the book I'm working on right now is a book by a French poet named Chambertin, who put together an anthology. It's called The Flight of Wild Geese, and it's an anthology of a minor tradition in Chinese poetry of reversible poems. And these poems were written so that you could read them in one direction and they would mean one thing, and then you could read them in the other direction and they would mean something else. And at the center of this book is the most remarkable poem probably ever created, a poem that a woman poet wove or embroidered, depending on what story you hear, in the 8th century, 4th century. Her name was Su Wei, and the poem was a little piece of cloth, 8 by 8, 9 by 9 inches, and it was read. It had a circle of characters and then lines going diagonally and squares, and altogether there's something like 3,120 poems in it. So that's like the ultimate reversible poem, but I'm not going to try and give you any more of that one. I picked a couple simpler ones, just to give you a sense of how these work. So if you can see the board, you can see what the Chinese characters look like, and then the romanization, and then I'll read the translation, which is translated from French into English. So this is a multiple layer translation. The first one is by Lu Guimeng, and it's called Up at Dawn to Go About His Business, addressed to P. Rick Sway. And I'm reading, and then these were a pair of poets who wrote to each other. So there's an answer to this poem by P. Rick Sway. Up at Dawn to Go About His Business, addressed to P. Rick Sway. Water calm, moon setting, celebrating this peaceful landscape. Dark curtain of drifting fog, thinking of the man who rises. Clear dew at dawn, it beads on blossoms nearly withered. Distant wind, light, it stirs the orchids once again in bud. At the highest point of the fallow land on the rampart, the young woodcutter seems small. Lichen on stones, one after another, familiar egrets arrive to pass the night. In the sunlit spot, the monastery. To find it in the country, it would be good to go together. Moss-covered characters on the old stela, fine, regular writing. And this is the reverse poem. Regular writing, refined characters. The moss-covered stela is ancient. We like leaving together in search of the monastery in the sunlit spot. Familiar egrets come to pass the night, sharing the stones covered with lichen. The small child, there where the wood is cut, climbs the barren rampart. The orchids newly out are stirring, light wind from the distance. Half fallen, the blossoms hang, the dew of dawn is clear. The man thinks first of the drifting fog like a dark curtain. Peaceful landscape, celebrating the moon, waves subside calmly. And this is the poem in response. What? Oh. Yeah, okay. This is the poem response. In response to Up at Dawn by Luke Wee Meng. A solitary mist rises at dawn. It begins by winding into the plain. The broken trees hardly visible in the midst of the waves. Behind the lake, the fishing hook and rod are moved with the night rain. Beside my headrest, the bamboos are flattened by the dawn wind. The plum trees, as in a drawing, seem wet, lightly saturated with ink. The perilla, as in a painting, its many veins have nearly lost their red color. Without anything to do, having a cup, holding it the whole day. It is with you alone that I love to hide behind the wall to the east. And reversed. At the eastern wall, the hidden lovers, it is only with you that I share them. All day long I hold a cup. Is there something else to do or not? The red has lost half its color, painting a vein perilla, saturated with lightly moistened ink, drawing of plum trees. The dawn wind strikes my pillow slantwise. I sleep beside bamboos. The rain moves the rod when fishing in the lake behind. In the midst of waves, fragile trees break into pieces. On the winding plain, the dawn begins to break, a solitary mist. So, I just started translating this book not that long ago, and what struck me when I started working on it is that I've been working on poems where I was trying to loosen the hold of the linear line and let the reader be more involved in the reading of the poem, and I realized as I started this translation that nothing is new under the sun, because basically Chinese does that. And Michael, your question this afternoon, is there an equivalent in English to that experience of letting the having the reader be very much a participant in the creation of the poem, well, I think that is probably what underlies my efforts here. And they grow out of writing poems that I was doing on different objects where I was really unhappy with, the flat space on the page, and I think what happened is that the flat space on the page started opening up. So now for me, the space on the page is kind of like a three-dimensional space that I can move around in. And I would like the poems to be something like an installation, where you can go into the words and move in different directions if you'd like to. So I'm going to read a bunch of those, and I'm going to project them so you can see what I'm up to. You don't necessarily have to see the words, because I'm not sure you'll be able to. But you can see the shape of them. And in all these poems, there is a line which is darker. I consider that sort of the through line. So there's one way that you can read that will take you through the poem, and then once you're in there, you're free to move around in different ways. So this one is, the hawthorn in flower was my first alphabet. The hawthorn came into flower, a first white flame, turning the alphabet to kindling. Line is the scar of inquiry. Line is the hinge of landscape. Fox, my ski, deer tracks across snow. Line is this hill folding into another. Across snow, we're trying to ask where landscape, where tree line opens. I should say that the through lines often are not my own. In the first poem, the line about the hawthorn is from Renee Char, and in this one, the next one, the line is from Gustav Solberg, who we were talking about last night, a favorite poet, mutually favorite poet of ours. So the through line here is, the force flowing against us is also ours. Snow geese, the force of their argument, this outflowing of words. The wind, use it carefully and every day. We listened quietly, also diminished, also arranging ourselves against the wind. Another draft in the fire pit lifts ash that doesn't remember being wood. Because fire is a kind of forgetting. Patience can have nothing to do with waiting. Being that still leaf caught up in wind. So this manuscript is mostly those poems, but there's a center section which I'm going to read from now, which are kind of dream sequence And they look like this. They just go straight across the page in the middle. The bell had rung, the corridor was filling. As we hurried past the one who tends the caskets, we paused so I could be introduced. This is the one who tends the caskets when the ground's too frozen to bury them. The one he was tending was coated with dust. I knew he'd been looking after it a long time, and I felt truly grateful. "Thank you," I said. I looked him straight in the eye. We hurried, though now my husband was sobbing. Odd, I thought, since it's not his mother's casket, his mother's alive. The steps were regular stone, worn smooth. I was scrubbing them with matted wool, though it wasn't wet enough to clean them. I knew this is what I should be doing, and the direction I had to go was down. Cherry trees cut to stumps, the other groundskeeper preparing their elegy when we were interrupted by young ruffians playing with matches. Lost, I tried to sketch them a map of the orchards. It turned into a map of city streetlights. "Can't we continue?" asked my colleague, looking up from her score. Lichen and moss growing from beneath my knee as if I hadn't shaved carefully. I tried to pull it out, but the bark loosened all the way down my shin. Peeling back at my ankle gleamed a cluster of slick pebbles. I couldn't look. Still, it was my limb. I'm sure it wasn't grafted. There's no scar above the root. In dry leaves, mottled brown fledgling ravens with their parents. I lay face down, gratified they would come so close. Their heavy bills, their claws at my throat, only a little frightening. Now, as in childbirth, I want to say I'm fine, really, to anyone who loves me and would suffer to see me so. A letterbox, inside it a womb. The matted furry thing crawling in. That seemed all wrong, so I shook it free, tore the sack from its nose and mouth, asleep in my hand now, breathing. Your eyes, they're the strangest color. She leaned right across the table to say so. I was taken aback, having always liked the color of my eyes. Still, I knew what she meant. My pupils, convex, rectangular as a goat's. I gazed at her salad through the wire fencing, a small fist, stuffed clover, and grass blades. One buck hanging dressed upside down from a tree, that was okay, but when the hunters got closer, all the trees turned to deer. I tried elbowing them aside like winter coats on racks. The prongs kept tripping me, their heads swaying heavy as hems. Well, what was I expecting, living where I do? Flushing low birds from the trees, were they oak, partridge? No, cedar, waxwing, tips, lustrous, yellow, orange. But I'd stayed too long. My life had passed in anxious adolescence. Still a student, maybe I could teach. I'd yet to amount to anything. Speckled, oversized, invasive honeysuckle laden with berries. I needed to keep heading north. When her cry woke me, I knew to take it in, though why? Porcupine quills barbed like fishhooks rose from my haunches. I had birthed and raised my child, the winter diet of bark, expanding to whimper, to howl, to moan. And I'm going to read a couple poems that I think of as elegies to ice, because we're losing it. The first one, my friend, the poet Jean Valentine, was in Greenland and took a little excursion out to the icebergs and told me about it. And this poem came out of her telling one, the icebergs. Calving, what I heard caving in like whales, and the light breaking off, blue, enormous, pods disappearing, too small to reproduce. Though we tried, the women, to tend them, their enormity so fully changed any question of saving. Ice, blue, that sang. It's going to, although how can it be all right? And the second one comes from an amazing project that the artist Ronnie Horn did called the Library of Water, which is in Iceland, and you should check out the website for it. She collected samples from the glaciers that are disappearing from Iceland and put them in columns in a building in Iceland, and that's the Library of Water. The Library of Water. The Library of Water houses snowmelt, core samples you can read through, the history of glaciers. There are words for weather all over the floor. In Berlin, when it rains, plastic tubs like clints catch what drips through the library roof, or skull, since the library was designed to resemble the human brain. I forget most of what I read. A library in Alexandria, and a daughter library. These columns are what's left of the glaciers pulled from the shelves, the ice receding. What can be recollected? The sheer volume of each glacier, how they encase the earth, how they are crossed by the light. And I'm just going to do a few more of these. Quite unstable. A few more of these two-line poems. Let you read them with me. That writing not be some ribbon thing. Scribe that I am to the writing, the lightning as driven rain. That the lightning not ride the tree. That writing be contiguous with the river. That writing be something branching. Wings, tail. Green maple wings twirl down. Just this, no wind unsettling the leaves. In noon sun, no sudden unexpected surprise. Just this Phoebe on a maple twig, tail flitting. One of the themes that runs through this manuscript is a nostalgia for libraries, which I feel like we're losing to. So this is, many remained silently sleeping in the libraries. Many were left unshelved or leaned a little in their dark stacks. Many were left standing like horses, sleeping against one another, silently browsing old books after the libraries closed. she pieces together her joy. She is one who looks to remnant species, to patch together blue sky. An artist starts from the selvage of wetland. She threads through old growth. She is an artist, she don't look back. She is one who looks knowingly upon complex modern machinery as a joyous substitute. Tongue, the language, was first taught to children by letting them lick honey from letters carved expressive into a small wooden palette. Tongue was first an expressive organ. What I mean by rooted is web. The spiders have been revising my lines, my arms full of laundry at the end of the day. My lines, old stumps, clingwood, not taproot. What I mean by rooted is not taproot, but web. All the entanglements. Thank you. Now, take questions? Or not? Yeah.
About those pieces, when you're reading, does it look like that in front of you?
Yeah.
Do you ever read it in another direction?
Yes.
Yourself?
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Yeah. I don't feel like there's a definitive reading. I feel like there's, the through line will take you through it, but then the clusters will let you have your way with them. Yeah.
Jody, when you read that poem, did you just decide how to read it on the spot?
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah.
Do you have a title for the new book?
Yeah, it's the Spider's My Arms.
Spider's Mind?
Yeah, which is, the titles for all these poems are simply if I take the first words that appear on the page, so that becomes the title.
So not the through line is not the title?
No, the through line is not the title, and I really didn't want the through line to be the title.
But do the titles appear on the page or only in the content?
Only the title.
Only.
Yeah. Yeah.
Formation of words, the formation of words, are those that are intended to be visual as well as creating a picture?
I wouldn't say a picture, but yes. I mean, there's one that is about the making of a snowflake, and it is very much like, it's almost a snowflake shape, and that's as close as they get.
The geese?
Oh yeah, the geese is the V is in that one. So yeah, there's an element of that, but I don't need to be the primary element. Yeah.
How do you convey a piece like the sonogram with raven calls on the page?
It's in the book. Basically, I mean, I read what's on the page. Yeah. Yeah.
And is that produced just from the listening to the
No, the transcription in the book comes from a book by Bernd Heinrich on ravens. So those were actually, he did a sonogram of raven calls and then transcribed the sounds. So that's where the text comes from. But I have revised it because I've been hearing ravens lately, and I realized that there's a clucking sound they make, which I hadn't heard as a clucking sound until recently. So I had to change how I read that part.
Are you ever nervous with these types of poems that, like you read it so eloquently and it felt like a really strong message, but someone else who reads it totally different? Are you ever nervous about?
I would love that. I mean, that's what I want to happen. That once you're inside the poem, you're making it, and I would hope that would happen. Yeah.
So when you're actually piecing together this poem, are you thinking about it linearly at all? Or is it really just what comes?
No, I don't. When I start writing these, I'm already in the whole field. And the through line is usually the first part, and I have to try, I go through like a lot of stacks of paper, because I have to keep doing it until I get the through line in a pattern that I like and that I feel like I can work the other materials, which I may have notes toward, but it has to be some way that I can work the other materials around it that pleases me and that seems to be essential to the movement of the poem. Like the first one, the Hawthorne one, I feel like that's kind of a double helix.
Yeah.
Like those two twist around each other.
Yeah.
And that's different from like the geese one where, there is a sense of force going this way and the words going, the wind pushing back against it. So, yeah. Okay, well, yes, David.
I just noticed, sort of follow up on the question to you, that when you read them and everything you read makes sense. And I never thought of this before, but as I was sort of watching you, and I saw, sometimes I wanted to go off and let it not make sense.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So that's okay.
That's fine.
Good.
Yeah.
It seems like another Richard's that they can make sense and not make sense.
I'm thinking of your poem objects, and wondering, do you write them on the objects, and how does that change? How does writing on a different surface change the thing that you end up writing?
We talked about that a little bit in Mary's class today. It really depends on the poem. Some of them started with the object, and then the words found their way onto the object. And other ones, I had written the poem on paper, and it didn't seem happy there. It wanted to be on something else, and then it found what it was that it was on. But yeah, it's certainly like the poem on the egg. I had to go through several eggs before I got it to spiral the whole length of the egg and end at the right place. Yeah, and it's it's pretty hard to write on a round surface. Like it doesn't do the same thing, that it's not as accommodating. So I had to find the right writing tool often that would work with that surface, and it's pretty hard to revise slate. Like if I'd find the right piece of slate, I would find a piece that wasn't as good to work on first before I committed the poem to the actual piece. Bobby?
How autobiographical were your poems early on and now, or in the middle space?
Yeah, that's a good question. Early on, they were much more autobiographical. And I think what happens, this came up in class today too, that I think as a beginning writer, part of why you're writing is to understand yourself and to figure out your own being in relation to the world. And as that just happens, or as that gets more settled, it becomes less interesting. And the world itself becomes more interesting. And so attention shifts from autobiography to maybe creation, like the creative process itself, and how that can be a way of operating in the world becomes more interesting as subject matter. So I'd say these have that element in the way that any kind of we were talking about abstract expressionism this afternoon, that, you know, there's an element, I mean, those poems or abstract expressionist art are not empty of autobiography. It's just not the story of autobiography. It's the expression of it in a different way. All right, well, you've all put in a long day with poetry, so thank you very much for your attention.